Welcome back to luxurious Silver Studios on West Street. This week's lesson, we're going to be kind of focusing on the extension into the Western Territories and the effects that it had on the people and the land. Moving west wasn't really an easy decision for people. It was very dangerous for many different reasons. And there were different reasons for people to move out there. And these were called the push-pull factors. Some of them were reasons that you got pushed into that direction, and others were reasons to pull you into that direction. So some of the push factors would include that things in the East, because of the population, were just too expensive. There wasn't a whole lot of land to go around anywhere. Businesses, there were probably too many businesses in that general vicinity. Guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie were kind of eating up the customers. Religious freedom. Mormons looked for a place to go because they were persecuted in the East, and they just wanted a place they could practice their religion. And they weren't the only ones. And if you had committed a crime and were trying to avoid the law, then the West would be a good place to go. Plenty of places to hide. So those were the reasons to be pushed away from the East and to move out to the West. As far as a pull factor, there were a few different things that were happening during this time that made it easier to go out there. So one of them was the Pacific Railway Act. And what this did is it gave railroad companies large pieces of land for every mile of railroad track that they built. So if they built a mile of track, they would get so many square miles of land around that mile. People could settle there. This was the reason why some major cities were founded along the ways, because they would set up along the way as a place to get supplies, or stay at a hotel, and then they just grew from there. Another pull factor was the Morrill Land Grant Act. This was given to state governments. They would give state governments millions of acres of land out west. And what would happen then is the land would be sold to anybody who wanted to buy it to pay for what they called land grant colleges. They were trying to promote more education and create colleges out there. And with the selling of the land, it would help fund these colleges. And it also encouraged people to settle out west. The last one, and maybe the one that had the most factor to it, was the Homestead Act. In essence, this was cheap land given to anybody that wanted it, as long as you followed the rules. It would give you up to 160 acres of land for a small fee. The owner had to be at least 21 or the head of a family. So you could be under 21, but as long as you were the head of the family, then you were eligible for this. You had to be an American citizen, or you had to be someone that was filing for citizenship. You had to build a house on the land and live there for at least 6 months of the year. You had to farm the land for 5 years in a row before they made you the actual owner of the land. And this act would create over 372,000 new farms. Now, as you can see here, this is an example of a sod house, because when you moved out west, you had to use what was available to you. And there weren't a whole lot of trees, and there weren't as many rocks, and it was wide open land. So a lot of people built their homes right out of the dirt and the grass, and they were called sod houses. But as you can see from these, they made it pretty easy for you to move out there. They wanted people to move out to the west. They wanted it populated. It would alleviate some of the population in the East and even some of the Pacific West cities that were getting bigger. And it would also help to keep people who wanted that land away. If it's populated, it's harder to get rid of people. Now, owning private property in the West was somewhat a stable thing. We always talk about the wild, wild West, and there is something to that. But how did you make sure that your land was yours? It was measured, it was registered, and it was deeded. It would be kept in some kind of public records. If you had cattle, you may have seen this in the movies or so on, that they would brand them. They would actually take a red hot brand, something that would have a symbol on it that would represent your family or your business, and they would put it right on the cattle. So that way, if someone tried to steal it, you could say that cattle is branded with my mark and it's mine. Water rights. Now, this could be a big thing. If you live downriver from other farms, if they were to dam up that river, you would lose water. And that did come up at some points. It could cause some major problems. So They did try to uphold water rights as much as possible. And it was up to state and local officials to make sure of this, which you would think. Now, land speculators were a different business, both good and bad. What they would do is they made a living of using whatever money they had, whatever capital they had, and they would buy large chunks of the cheap land. And then they would go about breaking it up and trying to sell it for profit. Now, many of these guys were corrupt. They would do whatever they could to boost the value of the land, or at least make it seem like the value of the land was higher than it really was. They drove up the prices. They made a lot of money off of this, and oftentimes were very corrupt. Now, moving west again was very dangerous, but if you were in a minority group of some kind and you were looking for some kind of option that you couldn't have in the east, this was the way to go. So it was cheap land, there were jobs and so on. And this was a lure to Germans who brought the Lutheran religion with them, Italians, Irish, European Jews, and Chinese that were establishing small communities. And oftentimes these people took the jobs in mining and the railroad that many people didn't want. They were dangerous, especially the mining ones. They were exceptionally dangerous jobs. And even Mexicans and Mexican Americans were there to help with farming and ranching. Many Mexican Americans and Mexicans became cowboys. Now, with all these different groups moving out to the west, there was going to be conflict because there were many different Indian tribes that had lived in the west for thousands and thousands of years, going back to the last ice age, where the Bering Straits was rid of water. So everything was frozen and the water levels dropped. So people from Asia crossed into Alaska and they started to move down into other parts of the Americas. And then through time, different tribes lived in different areas. The Plains Indians lived in what we call the Great Plains. This is this area of land that pretty much is between the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains. This is some of the best farmland in the world. You have a lot of water draining from the mountains down into the plains, making it very fertile. And the Plains Indians had a certain way of life. Some of them were nomads. They would go from place to place. They would follow the buffalo. They were hunters. Others would eventually kind of settle down and become more like farmers. And then you had the introduction of the horse. The Spanish conquerors came here in the 1500s and they introduced the horse to the North America Plains Indians, which helped them with hunting and protecting themselves. So the horse allowed them to follow herds of buffalo, and the buffalo, you may have heard these stories, the buffalo supplied many of their needs. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but the story, the legend is that Indians could use the buffalo for practically everything, and that hardly a part of the buffalo was not used. They didn't waste anything. And with the horses, it made it exceptionally easier to try to hunt down the buffalo. But as anything else, any other kind of new technological gadget, it will be used for warfare eventually. So the horse also created more warfare between the tribes. Nomadic tribes won the battles often because villages were set up around farms. Farmers were more about creating life. Hunters were more about killing. That's how they knew how to do things. So if they're going to come in conflict with each other, the hunter is going to have a better advantage. They're going to know how to use the horses better. They're going to know how to use the weapons better. They're not going to think twice about killing when they need to. As you move on after the Civil War, more and more white settlers moved to the Great Plains. And as you can see, it's going to be a lot easier as a number of roads get built out there. The Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail, the railroad, the transcontinental that was built is going to make it much easier for these people to go out there. And not only the railroad, but one of the main reasons that people moved out there was the gold rush. If people hear that there's gold somewhere, they're going to go out there as quickly as they can to try to make as much money as they can in a short amount of time. As the whites moved out there, they thought they had the right to the land. They thought they could be more productive than the Indians were. The Native Americans saw them as invaders. A lot of this had to do with philosophy of ownership. The European way, the capitalist way, was to try to own as much as you can, to try to get as much as you can, to own it, to do well with it, and so on. Most Native American tribes were more of a socialist way of looking at things. Everything was shared. Everybody did their job. It was a community effort. If we all help each other, then we'll do well together. We'll survive. And with the crazy kind of weather that was out there and all the different threats to life, they needed to bond together. But as the whites went out there, they didn't see it that way. They felt like if I can own 100 acres of land for myself, it's mine, and you need to stay off of it. So this is where a lot of the conflict stems from. The U.S. government, in an attempt to try to get as much land as they could, tried to purchase a lot of the Native American land by treaty. Now, treaties can be very tricky. It depends on how enforceable they are. Some of them were done under shady circumstances. But what a lot of these treaties did is they tried to move Native Americans into what we call reservations. And these are just plots of land that were set aside by the government. If you're a nomadic tribe and you're used to moving around all the time, then reservations are not going to work well for you. What happens if the buffalo goes off the reservation? You can't chase it down. So there are going to be conflicts with this. And many times the tribes did not have much of a choice in whether to sign these treaties or not. There was much corruption and fraud when the treaties were made, so the treaties oftentimes became useless. And then once the treaties were signed, the reservations were oftentimes unprotected. White settlers oftentimes went in there. If there was gold, there was silver, there was oil, there was animals, whatever they wanted. If they needed it for grazing, they'd go onto the reservations, and tribal rights were kind of squashed. The U.S. Interior Department, to their credit, did create the Federal Indian Bureau, which was supposedly supposed to supply the reservations, but they were very weak. We see that even today. There's supposed to be certain Indian rights in the government and laws and so on that don't get a whole lot of play. They're not very strong. And oftentimes, even to this day, Indians and reservations are kind of put on the back burner. Native Americans were also frustrated by the stealing of land. The killing of the buffalo is going to be a big one. White hunters are going to come out and they're going to nearly wipe all the buffalo from the face of the earth until finally the government stepped in. Diverting water supplies, we talked about that before. Damming up the rivers so that the water doesn't flow down through their territory anymore. And then just attacking Native American camps, which we're going to get to in a little while. So the two sides of the war. Native Americans were outnumbered and outgunned almost every single time. One thing that has always been the case with Native Americans is they are very susceptible to disease. Even when the first white settlers came here, smallpox wiped out 90% of some Native American tribes. They are very susceptible to these kinds of things. And starvation also. Most attacks by them were small hit and runs. So it was kind of the guerrilla warfare style that they taught of the Patriots during the American Revolution. The French tried it during the French and Indian War. And when you're outnumbered and outgunned, that's the way to go. Hide, hit, and run. They were often on their own territory, which can be an advantage, but also, it's a disadvantage because it's your territory that's getting destroyed by this. And sometimes they were sold guns by the whites, depending. Anybody who's looking for a profit might try to sell some guns to Native Americans, and that was seen as traitorous in some cases. The other side of the war were the U.S. soldiers. Now, keeping in mind that many of these soldiers were just coming off the Civil War, the ones that had survived anyway, most soldiers were in the South for Reconstruction. The leftovers went out west. Those in the frontier, some of them were drawn to the frontier because of the allure, the danger, the freedom, the wide open spaces. It is beautiful out there. But they oftentimes had to deal with poor supplies, low numbers, low pay, and very, very dangerous work. Some of the dangers included armed thieves, Native Americans, animals, weather, and accidents. And when you get into the weather, out in the Great Plains, you can have practically anything that you want. You can have floods and you can have droughts. You can have scalding hot weather and you can have ridiculously cold snow patches, ice patches, tornadoes. It's just ridiculous. And then when you started getting into some of the like you talk about animals, but then you start talking about some of the plagues. If you ever seen a locust plague, those can hit hard. Dust storms when they hit. And then this disease, which probably killed more than the rest combined. Smallpox and cholera, once it hits, it can wipe out an entire family in a very short amount of time. There's no hospitals. There's really no way to stop it from happening. So then we get into some of the bigger conflicts between the Native Americans and the soldiers. Now, this is not to say that this is a one-sided thing. Native Americans are going to be massacred in many cases. Not all soldiers were evil people. They were trained to be killers. They were trained for war. They're just coming off a war. They were given orders. Native Americans could be just as torturous and just as bad as any soldier. They were known to go out and kill children and elderly and rape women and take them as prisoners and so on. So when it comes to war, there is no perfect side. Now, having said that, there does seem to be a trend of unfairness to this. So when we talk about the Sand Creek Massacre, this happened in 1864. So the Civil War was actually still happening when this occurred. The governor of Colorado reached an agreement with the Cheyenne chief Black Kettle so that they would go to a camp near Sand Creek and live peacefully. So you can see here, this is Denver. Sand Creek is over here to the eastern part of the state. A man named General John Chivington and 700 men attacked the camp. They massacred the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. Now, here's the problem. According to reports, Black Kettle tried to raise a white flag and an American flag. He was trying to stop the massacre before it happened, but it didn't stop the killing. Between 150 and 500, mostly women and children, were killed. And that's why they refer to this as a massacre and not a battle. One of the more famous battles is the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's Last Stand. So to give you some background on this, this takes place in South Dakota. You can see the state here. In 1876, so the Civil War has been over for a while, and Reconstruction is just about coming to an end at this point. This was a 2-year war between the Sioux and the United States government that was pretty much fought over a road being built in Sioux territory. So you can see the reservation here that's marked off. The government wanted to build a road through the territory. The treaty ended the road and put the Sioux on a reservation in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Now, if you ever go to South Dakota in the Black Hills, that's where you would find Mount Rushmore with the 4 presidential faces on the cliffside that are carved out: Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln. All right, now, the Indians agreed to go to the reservation, but there were rumors that were gold in the Black Hills. The U.S. soldiers find out about it, and once they found out about that, it was all bets off. This caused some like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse to rebel and leave the reservation. The soldiers were going in there trying to get the gold. They felt like their rights were being trampled on, and so they left the reservation. Civil War General George C. Custer was sent to round any rebelling Native Americans up. So something you have to understand about Custer is that he was pretty impressed with himself, maybe a little bit more than he should have been. He was not considered one of the best generals in the Civil War. Obviously, he was a general, so he wasn't any kind of slouch, but he was not considered one of the better ones, and he wasn't, one of the better students at West Point when he, learned how to be a soldier. So it can be a little bit dangerous when you're feeling that full of yourself, going against tribes like this. Custer and his 300 men moved into land by the Little Bighorn River in Montana. You can see that up here. This is the path that Custer took from North Dakota into Montana, chasing after the Native Americans. When going into the land, 2,000 Sioux warriors attacked them and wiped every one of them out. And this is why they call it Custer's Last Stand, because every one of his soldiers was wiped out, including himself. Now, at first, Custer was seen as a hero. It came to be known as Custer's Last Stand because of this. They used to do big shows about this. I think Wild Bill Hickok and so on used to do traveling shows, and they would act out the final scene with Custer being the big hero and so on. But later it was clear that his ego had caused him to make a huge mistake. He could have saved his men's lives if he had been a little bit smarter about this. So the U.S. troops flooded in, killing Crazy Horse in retribution, and forcing many of them back to the reservation, and causing some to escape to Canada, where they were treated in a more friendly manner by the British. That takes us to the Battle of Wounded Knee, also in South Dakota in 1890. At this point, Sitting Bull was forced back to the reservation due to starvation. He's not getting any younger at this point. He's kind of an older man. So he agrees to go back to the reservation because of the conditions. The Sioux that followed him were adjusting to reservation life, but they did try to keep some of the Native American rituals that they had. And they were very religious people, and they had religious dances and so on. One of these was called the ghost dance. And they would hold hands, and they would whirl around in a circle and make all sorts of noises that were not understood by the soldiers that were there. So U.S. authorities did not understand what was happening. They attempted to arrest Sitting Bull, and they're in the middle of this ceremony and so on. He hesitated. He probably didn't understand what was happening or why they were doing it, and they're in the middle of the celebration anyway. It was out of context. He was then shot and killed. The other 120 men and 230 women and children surrendered. They were rounded up and taken to Wounded Knee Creek. As they were being disarmed, a shot was fired. Again, nobody ever seems to know who started what. We can go back to the Boston Massacre, the same kind of thing, Lexington and Concord. No one ever knows who fired the first shot. But a shot was fired, and tensions were up. The soldiers then all fired. All at the same time, and they killed 200 of the Sioux. And again, we refer to this as a massacre, not a battle. Now, some of the things that Americans were attempting to do, and we're talking about the United States government, they didn't want to keep having these conflicts. What they were hoping to do was create a process of assimilation. And assimilation is kind of like immersing yourself in another culture so that you kind of become part of it. I think we've used this in the past. If we were to drop you into Italy for a month, by the end of the month, you probably would have some idea of the Italian language. You would know some of the customs. You might even have a little bit of an accent because you would assimilate to what you're in. You really don't have a choice. It's a survival skill. But when it came to assimilation for Native Americans as being part of U.S. culture, these would include things like taking Native American children and putting them into schools that taught white ways. Tribal elders were ordered to stop religious and cultural rituals. Going back to the Sand Creek Massacre, you can see why. We didn't understand it. It causes problems. We want them to adapt to us. Christianity would be better. Forcing Native Americans to wear white clothing and to speak English. Sounds like something that we would say today. If you're here, speak English. And the Dawes Act, which divided reservation land into plots and forced each individual family to own a plot. This takes away from the typical tribal way of ownership. We wanted them to be more like Americans. Each family owns the land, not the tribe together. Many of these people became U.S. citizens, and they would become subject to local, state, and federal law. Many also sold their land to speculators for cheap prices. And finally, 2 million acres of land in Indian Territory or Oklahoma that were not yet settled. The U.S. government bought it and set up a race for settlers to claim it. There's a movie called Far and Away with Tom Cruise, and towards the end, they actually filmed this out. The idea is that you could buy a flag, and all the plots of land for acres and acres and acres were plotted out. If you got there first and put your flag down, if you staked your flag on that property, you got to own it. It was that simple. These people that were in this race and took the property very quickly were called boomers. There were others also that snuck onto the land early, and they came to be known as Sooners. So here's a piece of that movie. Yes, that was Tom Cruise punching a horse. And the movie doesn't get much better after that, but at least you get kind of a visual of how things were and how crazy it was, that you could just race out there and get a piece of land while the former owners were sitting there watching it. And that's it for part one. Part two is going to get more into the kinds of jobs that people did out west and the dangers that were involved, mining and ranching and farming, and then the beginning of populism, which is kind of important to this. So again, we'll put some questions out with this, and that'll be your assignment for this week. And hopefully see you for video 2. Talk to you.